In this video, we're going to be coding your very first object-oriented program. We're going to be talking about how to get started and how to code it, doing the basics. Now, we're going to add some more videos later on, making them more complex. But when you get started with object-oriented programming, there are some terms you must become familiar with because it's not about coding, it's about understanding the code. So classes are your blueprint for an object. Now, a class contains attributes that are going to be assigned to each object. Attributes are considered instance variables because they belong to the instance of the class. An instance of a class is an object that is being created from that class because there's all these special terms and it may overwhelm you when you're first getting started with object-oriented programming. Now, the code inside the class are controlled by something known as methods. Now, these are called non-return methods and return methods. Now, in VB.NET, these are subs and functions. In Java, they are void and non-void methods. So we also have something called a constructor. Now, the constructor is a special type of method. It is invoked, simply meaning it is called when an object is instantiated. So here we have that phrase, an object is instantiated, and you may be saying, what in the world does that mean? I don't know. I just started object-oriented programming. People are using all these phrases and terms, and I have no idea what they're talking about. All that means is that the constructor is going to be called when an object is created. And you may be saying, well, how in the world do I know when an object is created? Well, an object is created when the keyword new is used in our code. So when we create our first object momentarily, you will see when the constructor will be called. Now, when you're talking about object-oriented programming, you need to think about the has a relationship. When you think of an object, you need to ask yourself, okay, what does it have? So in this example, we are going to use a student. So I'd ask myself, what are some things a student has? Well, a student has a name. A student has an ID. A student has a grade level. So by thinking about the has a relationship, it allows me to think about the attributes I'm going to need for that class. Now, each student object we create today will have these attributes, and this makes them different than standard variables. If I create a regular variable called name, I can only store one name or one string inside that variable name. I can only store one ID value inside the variable ID. I can only store one grade level inside my grade level variable. Every time I create an object, they are by default going to have these attributes automatically. Now, our two students that we're going to use, we have some data for them already. So this student one is going to be our first student, and he's going to have the following information for his attributes. His name is going to be Jesse. His ID is going to be 53001, and we're going to put him in the 11th grade. Now, just so you know, when we do grade, it's going to be an integer, and that way we can use both strings and integers. This student, too, will have the following information. We're going to call him Walt. His ID is going to be 53002, and we're going to set him to grade 12. Now, quick note. This student one, we're going to be assigning values to the attributes using what is called set methods. For this student two, we're going to assign values by use of the constructor. That way, no matter where you are, you can learn both how to use set methods to set values to those attributes, or you can do it by the constructor. You need to know how to do both of these, so we're going to do both of those in this video. Now, we're going to output the information of both objects using get methods. So you'll see all that today. So let's go ahead and let's start coding. All right, so we're in our code, and I've already created our class and some attributes. Let's talk about what's happening here. So your class you want to make public. You want to make it available to the entire program. So we have public class student. This is going to hold all the methods, the attributes, everything for each object that I create as a student. Now, you'll see we have private, and you want to use private as much as you can. You definitely don't want to use public. That defeats the whole purpose of object-oriented programming. We want to keep everything contained to a class, so we want to make it private. Now, when you use inheritance, you can also inherit those private attributes, and we'll talk more about that in the next video. This video is just about how to get started doing the foundation. So we have name as a string, ID as a string, grade as integer. Everything's the same. The only difference is instead of using dim, we have the word private. And what that means is it can only be accessed from that class. Let's go ahead, jump down to our sub main. Let's go ahead and create an object of student so we can get these attributes as well as start assigning those. So we're going to do dim. What are we doing? We're doing this student one. And we're going to do that as new, and there's that keyword new, as a new object. What class are we using? What blueprint? Student. So this will instantiate an object or create an instance of that class. This student one is an object. It is an instance of the class student. So that is how you create an object. Now, let's go ahead and let's start assigning some values. So this student one dot name equals Jesse. And you want to do it correctly there. Oh my, we have a red line. This student one dot ID equals, well, it's not letting me use name. Let's try ID. Dot grade equals 11th. And you'll see we have some red lines. Well, here's the problem we've run into. Well, it's not really a problem. It's the purpose of object-oriented programming. We'll talk about how do you do it. So these errors are on purpose, and they're to prove a point. Name, ID, grade, we can't access them because they're private to the student class. I cannot directly access them. So how in the world do I assign Jesse to the attribute name, 53001 to his attribute ID, 11 to this student one's grade? How do I do that? Well, what we have to do is we have to indirectly access them, and we do that by using set methods. So we're going to go back into our class. This is what we call a void or non-return method. It's not returning everything. It's just going to set the name. So what we're going to do is we're going to do public sub, and we're going to do set name, and we're going to do in as string. Now let's talk about what this means. You have set methods and get methods in object-oriented programming. They're going to be used when you need to update a name or to set a name when you're not using the constructor. Now we can still set names later on if a student changes his or her name. We can update it and set it. But what this is right here is we're setting the name. We're going to accept in as our parameter, and it's going to be a string. It is common practice to use the first letter of your attribute as a parameter. So all we're going to say is name equals in, and you may be saying, well, hold on, down there you couldn't do that, but here you can. We'll talk about why in just a moment. So we're going to need another set method, and it's going to be set ID. So I'm going to do I as string. So that ID is going to be passed up. And then we're simply going to take that parameter I, we're going to store it in ID, and then I need one more set method because we need to set the grade. I'm going to do G as integer, and then we scroll down so we can see what we have here, and grade equals G. So now that I have these set methods, my object can call these methods and pass parameters up. So let's go ahead and do this now. So we have this student one. We can't access the attributes because they're private, but because these are public, we can access them from any sub or any part of the program we want to. So let's go ahead and let's do that now. So what we need to do is, and you could do this by asking, what is your name? What is your ID? What is your grade? Storing that into a variable and then using those set methods. So we're going to do this student one, and we're going to do set name. What is their name? Their name is Jesse. Now, here's what I am doing. Well, I'm using set name, which is a method. Now, if I don't put anything inside these parentheses, I'm going to get an error. And the reason for that is, if you're familiar with functions or passing arguments and parameters, you'll notice that we have a red line. Why do we have a red line? Because set name must take a parameter. So we're going to insert our argument, Jesse. Now the red line goes away. We're also going to do this student 1. We're also going to set his ID. And we said his ID was 53001. And we're going to go ahead and set his grade. And we said he was in grade 11. So there we go. We have done that. So now what happens is when we create this student, we're going to call set name. We're going to pass Jesse up to in as string. In makes a copy of Jesse, and then what happens here is that gets put to name. And we want to do here, we want to do by val. Visual Basic will do that for us, but we don't want to become sloppy, so we want to do by val. All right, there we go. Visual Basic VB.net will do that for you by default, but it's about understanding that code. We don't need to get sloppy here. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to create another student, but this time you do it by use of the constructor. We will not be using these set methods. Now I'm still going to need these set methods here because I'm going to need those for Jesse. Now what happens is when we create Jesse, or this student 1, this sub or this constructor gets used, public sub new. If I do not put it in here, Visual Studio will create one for me automatically. However, if I put one in there, that's fine. But here's the issue you run into. Maybe we already know the name of our students and we want to use the constructor. So here we go. Public sub new. Now you may be saying, well, hold on. We cannot have the same name. And you're absolutely correct, because we have the same name here. But what we have is we're going to have a constructor with what's called a different signature than the default constructor. And the signature is what goes inside these parentheses. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do by val in as string. I'm going to do by val I as string. And I'm going to do by val G as integer. Now you may be saying, well, that looks very familiar. And you're absolutely right. When we create this next object, we're going to go ahead and assign the name, the ID, and the grade when that object is created. So now you'll know how to use the constructor as well as the set methods when you're assigning values to those attributes. So here's what we do. We do the same thing. Name equals in. We do ID equals I. We do grade equals G. So now that I have that, when I create an object, when I use that keyword new, I need to assign a value for name, ID, and grade. And you may be saying, well, do we have to do that for Jesse? No, we don't, because what we have here is another constructor with a different signature. This is the default constructor. It has no parameters. Visual Studio creates that for you automatically. I have it here so you can see both. There are two different signatures here. So we are telling when we create the object which one to use. So down here, when I do dim this student 1 as new student, we're telling the computer we want to use the constructor that has no parameters. Let's go ahead and let's create student 2. So dim this student 2 as new student. Now, when I want to use the constructor with a different signature, I open my parentheses and I'm telling the computer, okay, I want to use the constructor with the following signature. I want to give the name Walt. I want to give the, now you'll see the red line, and that is because it has 3 parameters or 3 arguments it must take. We have the ID, which is 53002. We should see the red line again. And we have to do the last one, which is grade 12. And now that red line is gone. So now when I have this object, this constructor will be used. Now in VB.net, public sub new is how you create the constructor. There is no other option that you have. Public sub new is what you're going to be used. Now I could use the same constructor multiple times. I don't have to create one for each object. I can use the same one over and over and over and over again. This constructor, even though it's only being used one time, this is being used by Jesse. So this one's going to be called when I don't have any parameters or arguments. This one's going to be called. It's the default constructor. So Jesse is using this one. Walt is using this one. Now, if I wanted Walt and Jesse to use this one, I can. A constructor does not have to be specific to one object. You can use the same constructor over and over and over again. So now that we have this information, we have Walt, we have Jesse, how do we output their information? So that's what we're going to do now. If you need to pause and get caught up, feel free to do so before we resume. Now that you're all caught up, we're going to go ahead and we have set methods. We need to get the information by using get methods. So these set methods are non-void or non-return methods, or I'm sorry, these set methods are void methods because they don't return anything. They're also subs because they're not returning anything. What we need to do is create functions or non-void methods. So we're going to do public sub or function, excuse me. We're going to get the name. And what we're going to do is we're not going to take any parameters because we're not trying to set the name. We're trying to figure out the name. That's going to have a return as string, and we're simply going to return name. That's all we're going to do. So public function. We also need to get the ID. No parameters here. That's going to be a string. We're going to return ID. Now you may be saying, well, how in the world is it going to know which ID to return? We'll talk about that in just a moment. And then we have get, last one is grade, and that is an integer. So we're going to return grade. Okay, so we have these two objects. So if we call it, how are we going to know which ID to get, which grade to get, which name to get? Well, because these are objects, these objects have access to these methods. So when I do console.writeLine, and I say, student one has the name, what I can do is I can do this student one, and what I want to do is I have access to all the methods. And what I want to do is I want to get their name. That's all I'm going to do. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this because I need to do it for their ID and I need to do it for their grade. So I want to say has the ID, this student one dot, and what I want to do is I want to get the ID. This student one has the grade, or is in the grade, we should say is in the grade. And then all I'm going to do is use that get grade method. So now what I want you to do is go ahead, don't run this quite yet. What I want you to do is I want you to pause here, try to do that for this student too. Let's use those get methods just like we did here for this student too. Go ahead and pause the video while you try that. Okay, you gave it a try. Maybe you're just like, I'm not very sure what to do. Well, no problem. We're here to guide you. So this student two has the name. And all we're going to do is we're going to do this student2 dot get name. I can use that same method that I used last time. So we're going to say this student2, you want to be on the right line, this student2 has the ID. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to use that get method, this student2 dot get ID. And what that's going to do is that's going to return the ID. This student2 is in the grade. I should say is in grade, is in grade 11 and 12. So this student2 dot get grade. So now that we have that, we'll be able to output the information. Let's go ahead and put a blank in between these, just a blank line to separate them so it's a little easier to read. So let's go ahead, let's save, let's run this program and see if it works like it's supposed to. So there we have it. This student one has the name Jesse. We were able to successfully use those set methods to set his name. We were also successful in using the set method to assign a value to his ID. We were also successful in using the set grade for grade 11. We were also successful in using those get methods because we were able to output his name, his ID, and his grade using attributes not local variables. If you start using local variables to output those, you're moving away from object-oriented programming and back into procedural. In object-oriented programming, we should really be assigning values to those attributes. We did the same thing for Walt. Now, it's important to know that you can use local variables to get some information. So that's the last thing we're going to do. So we'll do this student 3 as new student, and it's going to use just the regular constructor. And what we can do is we can do name as string, we can do ID as string, and we can do grade as integer. Now, it's very important to know that when we're going to take this person's name, ID, and grade, we're going to call the set method. We are not going to output their name, their ID, and grade using these local variables. That is not object-oriented programming. So you may be saying, well, why in the world do I even have those? Well, I need to ask them, okay, what is the name? What is the ID? What is the grade? So what you can do is you can simply do this, enter their name, and then I can do name, console.readLine. And there's something else you're able to do, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I'm just trying to show you all the ways that this can be used. Enter their ID. So ID, console.readLine. And then what I can do is say enter their grade level. And then I can do grade equals console.readLine. Now that I have that information, I can actually use those set methods. This student 3 dot set name. I'm just going to pass up that name using that set method. So this, and it's not equals because you're using a method. So name, this student 3 dot set ID. We're going to pass up ID. This student 3 dot set grade. We're going to go ahead and pass up the grade level they entered. So that is something that you can do. You're going to record those variables local. You're going to pass them up, and you're going to set this student's 3's name, his ID, his grade level. And then what we can do is we can go ahead to make sure it's working, and it will be working. We can output his. So what we're going to do here is we're just simply going to change this to this student 3. And we'll say this student 3 dot, we want to get that name, we want to get that ID, and we want to get their grade level. So what we're going to do, let's run this program again. We're going to see those things, enter their name. So we'll say Herb, computer science, their ID is 53003. Their grade level, we'll say grade 10. And we can see we have this student 1, this student 2. We didn't put in that blank line, but that's okay. We can see those get methods are working. So this is the basis of object-oriented programming. In the next video, we're going to talk about what happens when you have attributes that are shared between multiple classes. And that's where inheritance is used. And then we're going to talk about how do I overcome those methods being private when I can't access them. So we'll see you guys in the next video. If you found this helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe.